Mademoiselle Berthe and Her Lover by George Simenon in the Maigret saga. I am fully conscious of my boldness in disturbing you in your retirement, the more so since I have heard speak of your charming home on the banks of the Loire. But surely you will forgive me when I tell you that it's a matter of life or death for me. I live alone, in the heart of Paris, surrounded by its busy crowds. I go about my business like any other girl, and yet at any moment disaster may strike, maybe a bullet fired from heaven knows where, or a stab in the back. The crowd will see me fall. My body will be carried into some pharmacy before being taken to the morgue. The incident will only rate a few lines in the newspaper, should it deserve mention at all. And yet, Monsieur le Commissaire, I want to live. Don't you understand? I am young and strong. I long to taste all the joys of life. You will no doubt be surprised to receive this letter in your country retreat, the address of which is not easily procured. Let me tell you, then, that I am the niece of a man who for a long time was your colleague in the police judiciaire, and who died by your side shortly before your retirement. I implore you, Superintendent, answer my call for help. Give up a few days or a few hours for me. Listen to the heartfelt plea of a girl who appeals to you because she does not want to die. At 10 a.m. on Tuesday and Wednesday, I shall be on the terrace of the Café de Madrid. I shall be wearing a small red hat. In any case, if you come, I shall recognize you, since I have a photograph of you with my uncle. SOS! 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 Maigret was furious. For one thing, because his first reaction, whenever he had allowed his feelings to be stirred, was always one of self-critical anger. For another, because he had irrationally chosen not to mention the letter to his wife, and he was slightly ashamed of having invented a pretext for coming to Paris. Thirdly, because the way he had hurried to keep this appointment was a proof that he was less happy in his garden retreat than he tried to make out, and that, like any beginner, he had become thoughtlessly involved in the first mystery that had cropped up. And finally, as so often happens in life, there was a material reason for his anger, a trivial and ridiculous one. When he left Meung-sur-Loire at 7 that morning, there had been an icy fog hanging over the valley, and Maigret had put on his heavy winter overcoat. Now, as he was sitting on the terrace of the Café de Madrid, the grand boulevards were bathed in bright spring sunshine, and lightly clad figures were strolling past. In the first place, he reflected, that letter smacks too much of literature. As for the colleague killed at my side shortly before my retirement, it can only have been Sergeant Lucas, and he never mentioned any niece. The terrace was deserted. He was sitting all alone at a small table, and not knowing what to drink, since he had already had his coffee at the Gare d'Orléans, he had ordered a beer. With luck she won't come, and I shall be able to go back on the 11 o'clock train. At the precise moment when the electric clock at the Carrefour Montmartre showed 10 o'clock, he saw a small red hat threading its way through the crowd, and a minute later a rather plump young woman, noticeably panting, sat down beside Maigret. "Excuse me," she gasped, putting her hand to her left side, where her heart must have been thumping wildly. "I'm always so frightened." And she added, looking up at him with an attempt at a smile, "But now you're here, it's all right. I promise I'll be brave." All this had lasted only a few seconds, and Maigret still felt some astonishment at finding this lively little person sitting beside him, her hands nervously fiddling with her crocodile-skin handbag. As the waiter was watching them, he asked her, "What'll you have?" "Something strong, if I may." "A brandy?" "Yes, please. I was sure you would come. What frightened me was thinking that you might not get here in time." "You're Lucas's niece?" "Yes. I thought you'd guess that. His great-niece, more precisely. If I didn't give you my name and address, it was because I didn't trust the post." At the same moment, she was staring at something, or rather at somebody, a young man who had just sat down on the terrace a few tables away. Maigret caught a fleeting glance of intense anxiety in the girl's eyes, and he growled, "Is that him?" "Who?" "The fellow over there." But she promptly regained her self-control, saying with a smile, "Oh, no. You're quite wrong. Only as soon as I catch sight of a man's figure, especially if he's wearing a fawn overcoat, I instinctively give a start. He noticed that instead of draining her glass, she just dipped her lips into it slowly. He also observed the ironical and somewhat contemptuous attitude of the young man, and realized that he must look like one of those elderly gentlemen with a weakness for young girls. "My name's Berthe," said the girl, seemingly averse to silence. "I'm 28. Since you've consented to take an interest in my affairs, I'm ready to tell you everything." Her red hat gave her a spring-like sparkle, but she was clearly a determined and self-assured little person. "For you have consented, haven't you, Superintendent?" "I know nothing as yet about your story. You shall know it. You shall know everything. You won't leave me in distress much longer." Was it the presence of the young man in the raincoat which prevented her from feeling at her ease? She kept looking round in all directions. Her eyes fastened on passers-by in the crowd, returned to Maigret, to the glass of brandy, to the young man, and she still made nervous efforts to smile. "Would you mind coming to my place? It's not far from here. Rue Caulaincourt in Montmartre. With a taxi we can be there right away." And Maigret, still sulky because the situation seemed to him ridiculous, tapped on the table with a coin, and he noticed, as they left the terrace, that the young man in the fawn coat was also summoning the waiter. It was number 67B, not far from the Place Constantin Piqueur, between a bakery and an Auvergnat's bar. A typical Montmartre house, with the porter's lodge next to the front door, a worn, reddish stair carpet, walls of yellowish imitation marble, and 2 doors with brass knobs on each landing. "I'm very sorry to make you climb so high. It's right at the top, 6th floor, and there's no lift." Once on the doormat, she drew a key from her bag, and almost at once a magical sight was revealed. Spring in the grand boulevards was pale and insipid compared with the spring that one beheld from this dwelling perched high above the roofs of Paris. Down below, the Rue Caulaincourt was like a dark river along which buses and lorries drifted by, and one felt sorry for the people whose lives went on so far from the air and sunlight. A French window was open onto a long iron balcony. All along this balcony geraniums were glowing red in the sunlight, and a canary was hopping about in a cage that still contained a little of its morning birdseed. "Take off your coat, Superintendent. Do you mind if I just go and tidy myself up? I dressed in such a hurry, wondering if you would come." All the doors were standing open, and the whole of the flat was visible. It consisted of 3 rooms, prettily furnished and meticulously clean, their cheerfulness enhanced by piles of brightly coloured dress materials. Mademoiselle Berthe, who had taken off her jacket, now appeared wearing a close-fitting yellow blouse patterned with tiny flowers. "Let me take your coat. Do sit down. I'm all in a muddle. I'm so happy, you see. I feel that the nightmare's over." And indeed, she was looking radiant. Her eyes were glistening. Her full, rosy lips were parted in a smile. "You shall understand. I don't know where to start, but that doesn't matter, does it? For you're used to such things. When you saw this room with my sewing machine and all these bits of stuff, you must have guessed that I'm a dressmaker. I'm even going to confess something else. I chiefly make dresses which my customers, who are all very nice ladies, ask me to copy from patterns which they bring me, and which come from leading fashion houses. You won't give me away." She was so overflowing with life that she gave one no time to think, barely time to watch her changing facial expression, and Maigret once again felt somewhat embarrassed at being there, in that atmosphere of femininity and youthfulness, like a respectable married man on the loose. "Now I've got a more serious confession to make. I'm ashamed, but it's got to be done. I could never have told my uncle Lucas. You see, Superintendent, I'm not a virtuous young person. I've got a boyfriend, or rather, I did have one. And it's precisely on his account." Maigret's embarrassment turned to confusion. Had he been fool enough to believe for one moment that something serious was involved, whereas this was just a case of a romantic girl being threatened by her boyfriend in the hope of getting her to come back to him? She chattered on. "I met him last summer at Saint-Malo, where I was on holiday. He's a young man of good family, the son of an industrialist who had gone bankrupt. He'd always led the pampered life of a rich boy, and then suddenly, at 23, he had to earn his living." What does he do? Maigret asked skeptically. At Saint-Malo he was selling cars for a big garage. Or rather, he was trying to sell them, for things weren't going too well. And Albert, that's his name, hates pestering people. Soon after I got back to Paris, he came here too and looked for a job. Excuse me, did he live here? And Maigret cast a glance towards the open door of the bedroom, where he could see a wardrobe with a mirror and a carefully polished parquet floor. No, she said. I didn't want him to. He had a small room in a hotel in the Rue Lepic. He often came here, but only in the daytime. He was your lover? She reddened and nodded. Then she got up to offer Maigret a glass of wine. I've only got some sweet white Bordeaux. I don't even know where I've put it. My life's in such confusion. Listen, I'll be brief, if I may, for I feel I'm going to get all worked up again. I found out I'd been wrong about Albert. I soon realized that he wasn't seriously looking for a job, and that he spent most of his time in disreputable bars. I've several times seen him shaking hands with some very shady-looking characters. You see what I mean? She was walking backwards and forwards. Her voice grew muffled. Tears were clearly not far away. A week ago there was that business. You may have read about it in the papers, but you probably didn't pay much attention to it. 4 young men robbed a radio dealer's shop in the Boulevard Beaumarchais. They weren't after the stock, which was too unwieldy, but the money, which they'd somehow discovered, was in the safe. They took away 60,000 francs. As they were making off, they were seen by the police. One of the youths fired a shot which killed a policeman. Maigret had suddenly regained his self-possession, and his figure seemed to have become more substantial, his gaze firmer. Automatically he lit his pipe, which hitherto he had not ventured to take from his pocket. And then, he said in a tone which was as yet unfamiliar to Mademoiselle Berthe, 2 of the thieves were arrested, 2 men well known to the police, one who's heavily pockmarked, the other who's known as the Marseillais. They were young fellows, practically beginners, and their headquarters is near the Place Blanche, where Albert often went. Who fired the shot? Asked Maigret, staring through tobacco smoke at the canary. It's not known. Or rather, the gun was found on the pavement and it was Albert's. It was easy to recognize as he'd borrowed it from his father, whose name was on it. The father came forward when he read about it in the papers. He was questioned at police headquarters. And Albert. They're looking for him. You know better than I do how these things are done. I suppose they've sent out his description. And that's why. She wiped her eyes and went over to stand for a moment at the balcony, with her back to Maigret, who saw her shoulders shaken by a sob. When she turned round again, she was pale and tense-featured. I could have gone to the police and told them the truth, but I was afraid to. I trust you, Monsieur Maigret, because I know you won't betray me. Look at this. She raised the lid of a soup tureen of imitation Rouen pottery standing on the sideboard and took out a letter which she showed Maigret. It was written in violet ink in an irregular hand. Dear Berthe, as you'll see from this letter, I'm at Calais, and I've got to get across the frontier as quickly as possible. But I'm determined not to leave without you. So I shall expect you. All you've got to do is put an ad in the intransigent saying, Albert, such and such a day, such and such a time, and I'll be at Calais station. I'd better warn you right away that if you were to show this letter to a narc, I'll have my revenge. What I've done has been for your sake. So you know where your duty lies. I hold you responsible for whatever may happen to me. I warn you, moreover, that sooner than go off alone, I shall prevent you from ever belonging to someone else. Understand this if you can. Your Albert. Why didn't you go to Calais? Maigret asked with seeming innocence. Because I don't want to be the wife or mistress of a murderer. I thought I loved Albert. I took him for a decent boy who was down on his luck. I helped him as much as I could. Her lower lip was quivering. Tears were imminent. Now I know that all he wanted, all he still wants, is my money. For he's well aware that I've got some put by over 15,000 francs in the savings bank. She burst into tears. He's never loved me, you see, and I'm so unhappy. I'm frightened. I don't want to go there. The thought that he... That he— Maigret got up awkwardly and patted Berthe's shoulder as she sat weeping with her elbows on the table and her face buried in her hands. She quickly pulled herself together. Somebody from the police came to question me. They very nearly took me off as an accomplice. I didn't tell them about the letter because I was sure that would have meant trouble for me. But I'm frightened. I'm sure he'll come back and do me some harm. Once, when the cat was rubbing against his legs, he picked it up so roughly that the poor thing has been lame ever since. I'd have done anything for him. If you had seen him, you'd have believed, as I did, that he was. And you really don't know the young man who was sitting near us at the Café de Madrid? Interrupted Maigret. I swear I don't. That's odd. Why? He had gone onto the balcony, from which he could see out over the Place Constantin Piqueur, and there, just at the corner of the Rue Caulaincourt, he saw the familiar fawn-coloured raincoat pacing up and down. I don't know. Just an idea. What's in your mind? Tell me. Reassure me. Promise me, Superintendent, that you're going to protect me. I've got to know where Albert is. If only I was sure that he'd crossed the frontier. What would you do? He growled. I should breathe more freely. Otherwise I'm sure he'll kill me as he— His present surroundings seemed to Maigret an epitome of the humble workaday life of Montmartre, with its delight in simple things. On a kitchen table he saw the cutlet, which was to provide the girls' lunch, and a carton of celery remoulade from a dairy shop, together with a cream cheese in a blue earthenware dish. Beside the sewing machine was a half-made dress, an evening dress of organdie dotted with spring flowers. In a china cup there were pins and buttons, a pencil, some tailor's chalk, and a few stamps. And this modest existence was brightened by the sunlight streaming in from the balcony that overlooked the city. Mademoiselle Berthe was sniffling, unashamedly showing a reddened nose and tear-smeared cheeks. I know I'm a blunderer. I say things too straightforwardly, just as they occur to me. All the same, unless you help me, I'm sure I tell you that one of these days you'll come and identify my body at the morgue. He's my first lover, Superintendent. There had never been anyone else before, believe it or not. I wanted to get married and have children, especially to have children. And now— I'll see what I can do, my dear, Maigret promised somewhat haltingly, for he hated emotional effusions. But even before he had finished speaking, she seized his hand and kissed it. Thank you, Superintendent, but tell me one thing more. I'm not a monster, am I? I did love him, it's true, but what I loved was the decent boy I took him for. I'm not betraying him deliberately. The proof of that is that I've said nothing to the police. It's different with you. I appealed to you to protect me because I'm afraid, because I'm too young to die. He had moved away from her again and was standing on the balcony with his back to her, his head haloed by tobacco smoke. What shall you do? She went on. Of course, I'll stand the expenses. I'm not rich, but I told you I had a little money. Isn't that a hotel over the way? Yes, the Hotel de Concarneau. Well, I shall probably go and take a room there. One piece of advice, don't go out any more than you can help. I won't go out at all if you like, except to buy food. Can't you get the concierge to do that? I'll ask her. I shall come back and see you this evening. A pity you don't know that young man. Which young man? The one who followed you to the Café de Madrid and who's keeping watch at the corner of the pavement. Unless, she began, her eyes widening. Unless he's an accomplice of Albert's. Suppose instead of coming himself, he's got one of his friends to— I'll see you later, growled Maigret, making for the door. He was not satisfied. He did not know why. On the landing he picked a piece of white cotton off his sleeve, and as he went down the 6 floors he was wondering what he should do. On seeing him, the young man in the raincoat dived into a bistro at the corner of the square, and Maigret followed him, ordered a large glass of beer, made sure the phone booth was in the bar room itself, and went into it, deliberately leaving the door ajar. Hello? PJ, get me Inspector Lacroix, please. Yes, Jérôme Lacroix. It's his Uncle Maigret. Hello? That you, son? How are things? What's that? Well, can't be helped. It'll have to wait. Jump into a taxi and come to see me here in the Rue Caulaincourt. Wait a minute. He leaned out of the phone booth and asked the patron, "What's your place called?" "The Zanzibar." Maigret spoke into the phone once more. "At the Zanzibar? Yes. I'll be expecting you." No, your aunt's as fit as a fiddle. So my. See you soon." As he returned to the bar counter, he thought he noticed an ironic flicker in the grey eyes of the young man, who was wearing a light-coloured suit, two-toned shoes, and a snakeskin belt. "Like a game of poker dice?" he asked the patron. "No time." "What about you, monsieur? Play you at poker dice for the next drink." Maigret hesitated, and finally picked up the dice box with a gesture as menacing as though he had already slipped the handcuffs onto the young man's wrists. "3 kings at a throw," the young rascal announced, adding, after a glance at the superintendent who was picking up the dice, "Your throw, Monsieur Maigret." Maigret threw 2 9s and a 10, then queried as he made a second throw, "You know me?" "We all know the cops," the other retorted smoothly. 3 jacks. You're staying in. What's your drink? You can't have been offered much up there, apart from that sweet wine that tastes like gooseberry syrup. On such occasions there is only one thing to do, to keep calm and not betray one's irritation. Maigret went on smoking his pipe in brief puffs and picked up a second match, for his opponent, with angelic suavity, had just turned up 3 queens. "You really don't remember me, after grilling me that night from 9 o'clock till 5 in the morning?" He was jauntier than ever. He was a good-looking scamp, and he knew it. Above all, he had such a candid smile when he chose that it was difficult to be angry with him. "Something to do with dope? You're not there yet?" "It was a few years back. I was a messenger at the Célice in the Rue Pigalle, and you were set on getting me to talk. 3 kings in 2 throws. That's better. Good. 2 9s. Pass me a mat." And after ordering an apéritif with the same nonchalant and good-humoured air, he attacked, "Well, what do you make of my little sister?" The bistro was practically empty, save for one drunk who was obstinately playing with the fruit machine, and the patron took advantage of this to fill up his carafes with the dregs of his bottles. "You surely cottoned on from the start, didn't you?" It was over 4 years since Maigret had heard the familiar accent of the underworld, and he almost broke into a smile, like an exile meeting a compatriot. "With all due respect, between you and me, I hope you didn't let yourself be taken in." Softly. Softly. To gain time, Maigret could always drink a mouthful of beer, or knock out his pipe and fill another. "I knew she'd be at it again one of these days. You can always tell when that sort of attack is coming on. But I'd not have expected her to bother a big shot like yourself. Careful, Monsieur Maigret. You're taking a queen for a jack. 4 jacks. You're staying in." He shook the dice. 4 kings. You're not in luck, are you? As for little sister, it's not her fault if she's a bit crazy. When she was only a kid, she was a bit odd, used to walk in her sleep. And glancing at the door, he exclaimed, "Why, here comes your mate. Better perhaps leave you 2 alone together." He drew back to let in Jérôme Lacroix, who had just alighted from a taxi. The 2 men stared at one another, the young rascal still wearing his engaging smile, and the policeman from the Quai des Orfèvres with a puzzled frown. "Morning, uncle. What's that fellow doing here?" "Who is he?" "Louis the Kid. You must have known him when he was a page boy in the Montmartre nightclubs. He thinks he's a joker, but I'm going to get him one of these days." Jérôme Lacroix, whom Maigret had brought into the police judiciaire, was a big bony fellow with thick hair and a stubborn expression. He had a long nose, small eyes, huge hands and feet, and he gave the impression of being morose, obstinate, ready to let himself be cut in pieces rather than fail in his duty in the least degree. "Come and sit over here, son," said Maigret, choosing a table from which he could see no 67B. "Do you know his sister?" "Whose?" "Louis the Kid's. Actually, I called on her just lately." The news did not please Maigret, but he showed no reaction. "You do mean Mademoiselle Berthe, don't you?" "Yes. A dressmaker who lives over the way." "Is my aunt quite well?" "You asked me that over the telephone." "So I did. I'm sorry. What do you know about this Mademoiselle Berthe? And Maigret observed with some satisfaction that his nephew was somewhat at a loss to reply. She's a dressmaker. So you've just told me. She's the mistress of a man called Albert Marcinelle, who's wanted for the murder of a policeman in the Boulevard Beaumarchais. Anything more? Well, that's all I managed to get out of her. Her place seems well kept. Her concierge speaks highly of her. Apart from that Albert, she never has a man to visit her, not even her brother, whom she's thrown out once and for all. But, by the way, that's not what brings you to Paris. It is. Jérôme, surprised, stared thoughtfully at his glass. He could not understand what interest such a case could have for his uncle, who had repeatedly refused to get involved in more serious affairs. You know, in my opinion, we shall pick him up one of these days, and that'll be the end of it. A low-down little scoundrel who's not worth bothering about. We've sent out his description everywhere, and I'd be most surprised if— You ought to put an advertisement in the Intransigent. Jérôme was becoming increasingly puzzled. To try and find him? Make a note of the wording, Albert Wednesday, 3:17 p.m. Arrange to have a policeman at Calais station at that time. If our Albert turns up, is that all? That's all. Do you think he'll be there? I bet you 10 to 1 he won't. So what then? So nothing. Kiss your wife and son for me. By the way, if anything new turns up, give me a call at the Hôtel de Concarneau, will you? It's 3 houses further on. Goodbye, Uncle. As Maigret paid for the drinks, he was already looking sprightlier than he had been earlier that morning, for he felt things had begun to move. Roughly speaking, his impression was that the police were oversimplifying the situation, and Mademoiselle Berthe was complicating it. Not far off, there was a small restaurant favoured by taxi drivers, with a couple of tables on the terrace, and as one of them was free, he sat down and discovered on the menu fricandeau à l'oseille, veal with sorrel, one of his favourite dishes. The atmosphere was so redolent of spring, with light puffs of air so warm and fragrant that, particularly after a bottle of Beaujolais, he felt light-headed and wanted nothing better than to lie down on the grass with a newspaper over his head. By 2 o'clock, he was at the Hôtel de Concarneau and, not without some difficulty, secured a room on the 6th floor front, exactly opposite Mademoiselle Berthe's balcony. When he went up to the window, he almost blushed, for the girl was busy trying a dress on a customer whose figure, more than partially undressed, could be made out in the bluish darkness of the room. He asked himself repeatedly if she was doing this on purpose, and even if she might not have caught sight of him in his room. But the warmth of the day was enough to account for her open window. Maigret practically never took his eyes off her, and he saw nothing in her behaviour which was not absolutely natural. When the first customer's fitting was over, she set to work on a blue dress, patiently, removing pins from between her lips one by one, kneeling for a long while, in front of a tailor's dummy covered with black cloth. Then she poured herself a glass of water, did some stitching on her machine, raised her head when she heard a knock on the door, and let in a second customer who was bringing her some dress material. From Maigret's observation post, it was almost possible to guess the words spoken from the movements of the women's lips, and he realized that they were arguing about prices and that the customer had to give way in the end. Not until 4 o'clock or thereabouts did Maigret think of letting his wife know that he would not be home that night nor, possibly, for the next few days, and he rang for the chambermaid to hand her a telegram and at the same time to order a bottle of beer, since the brie with which he had followed up his fricandeau had made him thirsty. Either that girl's very astute, he muttered to himself, chewing the stem of his pipe, or else what? Why had he got involved in this business? Why had he not gone home by the 11 o'clock train as, at one point, he had thought of doing? Let's assume that she's speaking the truth, as seems plausible. If that were the case, what was he to do? Act guardian angel, like those American private detectives who are hired to follow nurses and children to protect them from gangsters? It might go on for a long time. Albert seemed in no hurry to return to Paris to kill his mistress, and Maigret suddenly realized that he did not even know the man by sight. And suppose it were not true? What had made her appeal to him? Why had she lured him out of his quiet country home into this drab corner of Paris? He left his heavy overcoat in his room and went down. He stopped to ask the concierge at number 67B if Mademoiselle Berthe was in. "She is. As it happens, I'm just going out to do her shopping for her, as she's got too much work. Would you be kind enough to take up this letter for her while you're about it?" He recognized Albert's writing and saw the stamp, postmarked Boulogne. "So there," he muttered as he climbed the stairs in answer to an objection he had raised to himself. He knocked. He was kept waiting for a moment on the landing, and when she opened the door to him, he had to go into the kitchen since there was still a customer being fitted. The kitchen was as spotless as the rest of the flat. In one corner, there was an opened bottle of white Bordeaux and a dirty plate. He overheard, "A little tighter at the waist? Yes, like that. It's younger looking. When can you let me have it?" "By next Monday." "You can't manage sooner." "With the best will in the world, no. At this time of year everybody's in a hurry." Then Mademoiselle Berthe released him with a sad smile. "You see how it is," she said. "I do my utmost to look cheerful. Life has to go on in spite of everything. But if you knew how scared I am, or rather how scared I was because now that you're here, I have a letter for you." "From him?" He gave it to her. She read it, dry-eyed but with trembling lips. Then she handed him the paper. "My darling, I'm beginning to get worried. I warn you my patience is running out. I dare not stay all the time in Calais, where I'd be spotted eventually. I have to keep moving about. I had lunch in Boulogne today, and I don't know where I shall sleep. But I know that if you don't turn up, I shall do what I said, at the risk of being caught. It's up to you, Albert." "You see," she said dejectedly. "What does your brother have to say about it?" She gave no start. She did not even show surprise, only an increased sadness. "He's spoken to you? We had a drink together. I ought to have told you everything this morning. He's not really a bad lot, but he was left on his own too young. He tries to act like a tough guy, although he wouldn't hurt a fly. All the same, I had to stop him coming here because of the way he behaves. All the same, too, you lied to me this morning. I was afraid you might think— Think what, for instance?" "I don't know. That I was a girl of the same sort. You might have refused to help me." She pointed to the letter. "You've read that? It's dated yesterday. There's no proof that he hasn't taken the train since then." It was beginning to get cooler, and the sun had set behind the houses. Mademoiselle Berthe went to close the French window, and then returned to Maigret. "Can I give you a cup of tea? No? As you realize, I work for my living. I've always worked on my own to try and establish myself in a job. When I met Albert, I thought that meant happiness." She swallowed her sobs as she mechanically set about tidying the scraps of material strewn about. "Haven't you any girlfriends?" he asked, glancing at the photograph of a fair-haired young woman on the mantelpiece. Her glance followed his. "I had Madeleine, but she's married now. You don't see her any more? She lives outside Paris. Her husband is an important person. What Albert meant for me was— Couldn't you let me have a picture of him?" She did not hesitate for a moment. "It's true that you wouldn't recognize him if you saw him," she said. "Wait a minute. I've got a photo we had taken at Saint-Malo. It was on the beach." And she took it from the soup tureen, which evidently served as her treasure chest. It was a little snapshot taken by some holiday photographer. Albert, in white trousers, bare-armed, a linen cap on his head, looked like any young fellow one might meet at the seaside. As for Mademoiselle Berthe, she was clinging to him as though anxious not to let her happiness escape. "It's dark, isn't it? As soon as the sun goes down, the apartment is very dark. I'll put on the light." Just as she switched it on, there came a knock at the door. It was the concierge with a basket of provisions. "Here you are, Mademoiselle Berthe. Just put it all in the kitchen, Madame Morin. The lettuce is very nice, but as for the Gruyère, I had to— I'll see you by and by." And when she was once more alone with Maigret, she sat down, threaded a needle and put on her thimble. What did the police tell you? I hope you didn't mention that letter." Deliberately, he delayed answering, and she looked up and went on speaking more rapidly. "I'm afraid I'm not very sure how these things are done. When I wrote to you, I suppose you see that when I consulted you it was rather as a lawyer." "What do you mean?" "I mean about professional secrecy. I've been telling you everything, showing you letters. Oh, it wouldn't worry me if they arrested him. In fact, it would be the best way to set my mind at ease. But I wouldn't want it to be my responsibility. So if they were to start investigating at Calais and Boulogne now—" He gave her no assistance, and she was finding explanations difficult. She hemmed a dress with exaggerated assiduity. "Which would you rather?" Maigret asked her slowly. "What do you mean? That he should be caught or that he should get across the frontier?" She looked at him with calm, trustful eyes. "What do you think about it? What would happen to him if he were caught? What danger is he in, exactly? If it's proved, if he fired the shot, there's a risk of the death penalty." She averted her head and bit her lips. "Then, I'd sooner he got across the frontier, although one of these days he'll come back to fetch me, and if I refuse, he'll—" Maigret was holding the photograph of the two lovers, studying chiefly the young man's face, a fairly ordinary face with a mop of curly hair. "Obviously you haven't written to him yourself." "How could I have written to him since I don't know his address? And what could I have told him?" It was hard to imagine that tragedy lay just round the corner, so peaceful was the atmosphere. There were moments when Maigret could have fancied himself sitting at home opposite Madame Maigret as she stitched or darned his socks, for there was the same sense of calm, the same subdued light, the same order and neatness everywhere. The only difference was that Mademoiselle Berthe was younger and prettier, and dressed with a certain fastidious good taste. "Has he ever slept here?" he asked, just to say something. To which she replied with quaint naivete, "Never at night. On account of the concierge. And the neighbours. Next door there's an old couple who are sticklers for propriety. There used to be a young woman on the 4th floor who had a great many visitors, and they wrote to the landlord to get her thrown out." She recalled her duties as hostess. "Will you really not take anything? What do you usually drink?" "I don't want anything, I promise you. I'm beginning to think you've been worrying unnecessarily." Now he was walking about as he used to when he was questioning somebody in his office at police headquarters, in the days when he was still Superintendent Maigret. He kept touching things automatically, fiddling with the most trifling objects, playing with the pins in the china bowl, setting the soup tureen exactly in the centre of the sideboard. "In my opinion, when he sees there's no hope, he'll try to cross the Belgian frontier, and it'll be all over." "Do you think he'll succeed?" "That depends. Obviously, customs officers and policemen all have his description, but if he can get out by some smuggler's route—" "How easy would that be?" "I think it would be very difficult, because that's the sector where tobacco smuggling is carried out on a large scale. Come now, admit that you're still in love with him." "No!" "At any rate, that you'd be unhappy if you heard he was caught. Isn't that natural? It's 10 months since—" "An old married couple, evidently." He sighed, his voice softening a little. "Now I'm going to leave you." "Already?" "You needn't be afraid. I shan't be far off. Just over the way, in fact, on the 5th floor of the Hôtel de Concarneau. I must confess that this afternoon I saw your customers in their slips, and even one of them without—" "I didn't know." Mademoiselle Berthe's hand, when he grasped it, was soft and warm. "I trust you." She sighed rather sadly. "This is the first evening I shall go to bed with my mind at ease." Going down the narrow staircase, Maigret felt like a clumsy giant. On the pavement, where it was still daylight, he almost collided with Louis the Kid, who raised a finger to his grey felt hat and said in a bantering tone, "Excuse me, Superintendent, sir." Then Maigret had a sudden attack of ill humour. He felt he was floundering about in a hopeless bog. He wanted to get out of it at all costs, above all to extricate himself from the absurd position he had got into. "Come here, you. Do you want your return match at poker dice? At your service. What about paying a little visit to the Quai des Orfèvres? That's not a very good idea. Whatever you think, I'd like you to follow me there and answer a few questions which Inspector Lacroix will put to you." Louis was not enthusiastic. "Are we going by metro?" he asked. "We're taking a taxi." Maigret had never known a more ridiculous affair, and he reflected that if his wife had seen him a few minutes earlier in Mademoiselle Berthe's apartment, she would scarcely have believed that he was there in a professional capacity. He was hardly sure of it himself. "In you get. To the Quai des Orfèvres? Yes. Police headquarters." Jérôme would worm things out of the impertinent young rascal, and then they'd see what would happen. As for Mademoiselle Berthe, it was difficult to believe that she was in any real danger, seeing that Albert was still on the run between Calais and Boulogne. "You know the way—" "Right, now. Last room at the end of the passage." A room which Maigret had occupied at the start of his career, when there was still no electric light in the building. "Wait for me a moment." Jérôme was there, drawing up a report. "Would you like to grill the young scamp I've brought you? He knows more than he appears to." "Right, uncle." The scamp still wore his jaunty air, and he had deliberately kept on his hat. He treated himself to a cigarette, which Maigret removed from his lips. "Tell me now, kid. Where were you on the night of the burglary in the Boulevard Beaumarchais?" "What night was that?" "A Monday night." "Which month?" He was acting the simpleton. Maigret found himself longing for the old days when one could stamp on such a fellow's toes to teach him to be serious. "Where I was? Wait a sec. I think there was a Marlene Dietrich picture at the cinema in the Rue Rochechouart. And then? And then? Wait a sec. There was a cartoon, and then something about the plants that grow at the bottom of the sea." Jérôme would have had sufficient patience to keep on questioning him for hours on end. Maigret, however, had had enough of it. "Were you in on it?" "On what?" "That job." "What job?" Maigret felt like punching him in the face. He restrained himself in time. "Have you got an alibi?" "A good one. I was in bed." "You were at the cinema, or you were in bed?" "I was at the flicks first. Then I went to bed." Maigret had brought many others to heel, but here he had no authority to act, and his nephew seemed ill at ease. "You wouldn't by any chance be the fourth guy, the one they didn't catch?" The youth solemnly spat on the floor, declaring, "I swear I wasn't." At that same moment the telephone bell rang. Jérôme lifted the receiver and knit his brows. "What's that? You're sure?" He hung up again, rose to his feet, and not knowing what to do with Louis, left him in the office while he dragged Maigret into the passage. "That was emergencies. A woman has just been attacked on the 6th floor of 67B Rue Colincourt," his uncle completed the sentence. "Yes. The concierge declares she saw a man leave the house, bleeding profusely. There's blood all over the stairs. What are we going to do with him?" For Jérôme, who had a great respect for regulations, was embarrassed by the somewhat unofficial presence of Louis the Kid. Jérôme Lacroix could not resist constantly turning to Maigret and murmuring uneasily, "What do you think about it, uncle?" And the ex-superintendent would reply, while the shadow of a smile made his words even more enigmatic. "You know, son, I never think—" He was taking up as little room as possible. For a long time he sat quite still in a corner beside the dressmaker's dummy, smoking his pipe with an absent-minded air. Nonetheless, his presence embarrassed everyone. The local police superintendent, fearful of appearing ham-fisted in front of the famous Maigret, sought the latter's approval incessantly. "That's what you would do in my place, isn't it?" Every landing was crowded, and a policeman was with difficulty preventing people from entering the apartment. Another at the front door of the house was vainly repeating, "Since I tell you there's nothing to see." Many inhabitants of the Rue Colincourt went without their dinner that evening, so as to remain on the watch in the street or at their windows. The weather, as a matter of fact, was ideal, and from time one could see shadows passing behind the drawn blinds of the room on the 6th floor. Down below, an ambulance had drawn up. It stood waiting for about an hour, and then, to everyone's surprise, drove off again empty. "What do you think about it, Monsieur Maigret?" A problem had arisen. Mademoiselle Berthe, who had recovered consciousness, refused to let herself be taken to hospital. She was weak, for she had lost a great deal of blood through a scalp wound. But she displayed the intensity of her feeling by her gaze and by the nervous clenching of her moist hands. "It's up to the doctor," said Maigret, who did not wish to assume any responsibility. And Inspector Lacroix consulted the doctor. "Do you think we can leave her here?" "I think that when I've put in a few stitches, she can be left to sleep till tomorrow morning." All this was taking place amidst the usual confusion. Only the injured girl's eyes remained obstinately fixed on Maigret, and seemed to be appealing to him fervently. "You heard what the concierge said, uncle?" "As I see it, things must have occurred after this fashion. Mademoiselle Berthe went downstairs, probably to buy a few provisions." "No," Maigret said quietly. "You don't think so? Then why did she go down?" "To post a letter." Jérôme wondered how Maigret could be so certain of this detail, but he put off the question until later. "It's unimportant." "It's very important, but carry on." She had scarcely left the house when the concierge saw a man come into the building. The corridor was dark. The concierge assumed he was a friend of one of the tenants. Mademoiselle Berthe came back almost immediately. "There's a letterbox 100 meters away, in the Place Constantin Piqueur," specified Maigret, dotting his E's for his own satisfaction. "All right. She came back. She found the intruder in her flat. He attacked her and she defended herself. The man, seriously injured, to judge by the traces of blood on the stairs, hurried down, and the concierge caught sight of him running off, clutching his stomach." Jérôme looked round somewhat uneasily, and added with less assurance, "The trouble is that the weapon has not been found." "The weapons?" Maigret corrected him. "One blunt instrument with which Mademoiselle Berthe was struck, and another, probably a knife, used to wound the intruder." "Perhaps he took them away with him," ventured Jérôme. And Maigret turned his head away to hide a smile. Orders had been given to look for an injured man throughout the neighborhood. The doctor finished dressing the wound on the girl's head. In spite of the pain, she strove not to take her eyes off Maigret. "Do you believe, uncle, that it may have been her lover?" "Who did what?" "Who came here and attacked her?" Why did Maigret reply with such surprising certainty? "I'm sure it was not." "What would you do in my place?" "Since I'm not in your place, I find it hard to answer." The local superintendent came up next in quest of encouragement or approval. "This is what I've decided. The doctor's going to send a nurse round presently to stay with the patient. Meanwhile, I'll put an officer on duty below. Tomorrow we'll consider whether it is possible to question her, and whether there's any point in doing so." The girl had overheard. She was still looking at Maigret, and she had the impression that he gave her a slight wink. Then, reassured, she yielded to the torpor that was engulfing her. The two men, uncle and nephew, walked past the inquisitive spectators on the neighboring doorsteps, and Maigret filled a fresh pipe. "Suppose we go for a bite," he suggested. "It strikes me that we haven't had any dinner yet. There's a brasserie along the street, and I must say a choucroute garni would—" "You've just got to ring up your wife." During the whole meal, Jérôme never ceased to watch his uncle, like a schoolboy in dread of being caught out. And little by little this was making him bad-tempered, even resentful towards Maigret for being too calm, too self-assured. "Anyone would think you find this case amusing," he remarked, helping himself to sausage. "It is amusing. You're quite right. It may be amusing for the person who's not responsible for finding the solution." Maigret was enjoying his meal. Thick-set, broad-shouldered, he picked up his glass of beer with such obvious greedy delight that he might have served as a brewer's advertisement. As he wiped his lips, he treated himself to the sly pleasure of remarking, "I've found it." "What? The solution?" "You know who attacked Mademoiselle Berthe?" "No." "Well then, that isn't important. I mean that it isn't important either for her or for me." Jérôme's face grew longer still, and, but for the respect he felt for Maigret, he would have been red with anger. "Thanks a lot," he grumbled, bending over his plate. "Why?" "Because, instead of helping me, you're making fun of me. If you've really discovered something—" But he tried in vain to provoke his uncle. Maigret had relapsed into stolid impassivity. He ordered a second helping of choucroute with a couple of frankfurters and a third beer. "But look here, do you think I've done all I had to do?" "You did what you thought you had to, didn't you?" "There's a nurse in the room." "Yes. And a policeman at the door." "Of course. What do you mean?" "Nothing." Maigret paid for the meal. He refused his nephew's invitation to go home with him for coffee. And half an hour later, he was at his window in the Hôtel de Concarneau. On the other side of the street he could see Mademoiselle Berthe's room, where a dim light shone behind the blinds, and he could glimpse the figure of the nurse, huddled in an armchair reading. Down below on the pavement, a policeman was pacing up and down and looking at his watch every quarter of an hour. "It's up to her to manage now," Maigret muttered as he closed his window. And just as he was pulling off his socks, sitting on the edge of the bed, he remembered his nephew and added, "It's up to him to work out his plan." The room was full of sunlight at 9 o'clock next morning, as he went up to Mademoiselle Berthe's bedside, while the nurse was tidying up the room. "I've come to say goodbye to you," he announced, assuming a falsely innocent air. "Now that wretched Albert has failed in his attempt, I suppose you're no longer in danger." Then he read anxiety and almost panic in the wounded girl's eyes. She tried to raise herself up to find out where the nurse was. Then she stammered, "Don't go yet, I implore you." "You're really anxious I should stay here?" "Yes." "And you're not afraid, for instance, of my giving a few hints to my poor bewildered nephew?" There was something both gruff and fatherly about Maigret that morning, and yet he was well aware that Mademoiselle Berthe was hesitating between smiles and tears. She was watching him. The previous evening she had been feverish, and she might have misunderstood. The presence of the nurse complicated things still further, for the girl could not speak as openly as she would have liked. "By the way," Maigret asked, "you didn't get a letter this morning?" She shook her head, and he declared confidently, "You'll get one tomorrow. Yes, you will. A letter postmarked Calais or Boulogne. And I can give you one detail. There'll be a couple of pinpricks in the stamp." He was smiling. Standing up in the sunlight, he was playing, just as on the previous day, with the china bowl that held pins, buttons, and stamps. He did not need to. Press his point, for Mademoiselle Berthe's blushes showed that she had understood. Once more she looked round anxiously, for she was afraid of the nurse overhearing, but Maigret's glance told her that the woman was in the kitchen, where the hissing of the gas stove could now be heard. "Do you know your next-door neighbours?" he asked, changing the subject suddenly. "You mentioned an old couple, didn't you? Have they a servant?" "No. The wife does her own housework. And her shopping too." "Yes. Every morning about 9 or 10 o'clock. I know she goes to the market in the Rue Lepic, for I've met her there several times." "And the husband?" "He goes out at the same time and spends his morning hunting in second-hand bookshops in the Boulevard Rochechouart." "So that their apartment is empty," Maigret concluded in an unnecessarily loud tone of voice. And once again the injured girl hesitated between smiles and tears. She was still uncertain whether Maigret was for her or against her. She dared not decide. "Just fancy," he said in a friendly tone, though still speaking very loud. "They've put a policeman on duty on the pavement. And do you know what orders he's been given?" He did not even seem to be addressing Mademoiselle Berthe. He had turned to face the opposite direction. "To prevent you from going out, if the fancy should take you, and to prevent your enemies from coming in. I said coming in, mind you. The police, you see, are afraid they might come and attack you in bed." Thereupon he went to open the window wide, knocked out his pipe against his heel and filled another. There was a longish silence. It seemed as if the girl, as well as the superintendent, were waiting for something. Maigret paced anxiously up and down the balcony, leaning over to peer into the street, then shrugging his shoulders impatiently. He even muttered between his teeth, "The young fool!" Suddenly he stood motionless, looking down into the street. Mademoiselle Berthe seemed on the point of getting up, in spite of her weak state. The nurse was watching both of them, wondering what it all meant, and probably thinking they were a bit crazy. "There's a metro station at the corner of the street," sighed Maigret, "and a bus stop 50 meters away, and a taxi cruising by, into the bargain, so why?" This time, Mademoiselle Berthe could not resist questioning him. "Has he gone?" And Maigret grumbled, "He's taking long enough about it at any rate. You'd think he was tied on by elastic. At last. By bus? By metro." Then Maigret came back into the room, went into the kitchen to fetch the bottle of white wine, and sighed as he poured himself a drink. If only it had been dry. Mademoiselle Berthe was weeping uncontrollably. She was weeping her heart out, as they say, while the nurse tried to comfort her. "Calm down, mademoiselle. You'll do yourself an injury. I promise you your wound isn't serious. You mustn't be unhappy." "Idiot," growled Maigret, for that goose of a nurse had not understood that these were tears of joy that Berthe was shedding so wildly while the sunbeams played over her sheets. For, when the doctor came, Maigret had taken his hat and left without a word. With the nonchalant air of one who has nothing better to do, he had gone to the Zanzibar, and shortly afterwards had seen his nephew pass by on his way to subject Mademoiselle Berthe to close questioning. Suddenly, Louis the Kid had come in. He tried to draw back on seeing the superintendent, who, however, called out, "I've come to take my revenge at poker dice. Give us the dice, patron. An anise for this gentleman. That's what you like, isn't it, Louis? Your turn to start. 3 queens. I'm afraid that's not good enough. What did I tell you? 3 kings. 1. Up to me." And without a change of tone he went on, bending towards his companion, who was trying hard to keep his countenance. "Was the money in the soup tureen?" Louis the Kid shook his head. "Was it in Albert's pocket?" A fresh, even more vigorous shake of the head, and finally Louis confessed. "He ran off along the embankment and threw the notes into the Seine." "You're sure of that?" "I swear it's true." "Then why did someone come yesterday?" "Because he didn't believe me." Maigret smiled. It was a very special moment, not only on account of the spring weather, the sunshine, the lively atmosphere of the Rue Caulaincourt and his cool beer, but because a single remark had just now reassured him. It was such a relief that he felt a sudden hot flush of retrospective fear. Now he could go ahead. He was in a strong position. "Who fired?" "The Marseillais." Albert had given him his gun, and Maigret laughed to himself as he watched his nephew gloomily emerging from number 67B and waiting for the bus a few meters away from the Zanzibar. "What are you going to do?" asked Louis the Kid anxiously, still clutching the dice box. "Me? I'm going to say goodbye to your sister and catch my train." The bus passed, carrying away Jérôme Lacroix. Maigret crossed the street, and on the 6th floor found the nurse packing up her things. "I'm not needed any more," she announced. "The doctor's going to call once a day, and the concierge will look in from time to time." Maigret's eyes were gleaming with merriment. He paced about the room as though he were at home, waiting for the nurse to leave. Seldom had an inquiry given him as much delight, and yet it was a trivial affair about which, into the bargain, he would never be able to talk. He recalled his reaction on receiving the letter from Mademoiselle Berthe at Meung-sur-Loire. "It's odd," he had observed. "It seems sincere, and yet at the same time it doesn't." And the young woman in the red hat who had joined him on the terrace of the Café de Madrid had given him the same impression. She was really frightened, that was obvious. But it was obvious, too, that she was lying when she spoke of being terrified of her lover. She did put on the right tone of voice when she uttered Albert's name. Against her will, she spoke it too gently, too tenderly. Then, why had this determined young person ventured to disturb ex-Superintendent Maigret in his rural retreat? And why had she shown him, rather than the police, those letters sent from Boulogne and Calais? He had not understood to begin with, particularly since he had watched her for hours on end through the window, calmly carrying on her fittings like someone who is not in the least afraid of a vindictive attack. The stamps in the china bowl had given him an idea, and he had pierced them with a pin. "Why are you smiling, Superintendent? And why are you?" They were alone together now. The nurse had left. The noise of the street rose towards them, somewhat diminished, with the first hint of that smell of heated asphalt that is typical of Paris in the summer. Maigret, nonetheless, tried to put on a serious air and assumed his most ominous voice to say, "Do you know that if the 60,000 francs had been here, and if it was Albert who'd taken them, I'd have had you arrested? And yet you were, so to speak, acting on my behalf." "That's just it. That's what I realized. I realized that you had sent for me not to protect you against your Albert, but to protect Albert against himself. And if you had loved him a tiny bit less, I give you my word that last night I'd have hauled him out of his hiding place." "I don't see what my love," she murmured, reddening. "You may not see it, perhaps, but that's how it is." I argued thus. "Here's a young person who's got plenty of cheek, but who seems to me straight enough. She's trying to save a boy who's got into a bad fix. She tries to save him out of love. And I'm convinced that if the boy had really committed a murder, she'd have been revolted. He gave me his solemn word that he never fired, Superintendent. In any case, it was all my fault in a way. I knew he was friendly with my brother Louis, and that some of Louis's associates were shady people. Albert had been unable to find work in Paris, and he was eager to marry me, so he was easily persuaded. The others, whom I don't want to know, took him along to keep watch. One of them borrowed Albert's revolver in case anything should happen. When the police turned up and they all ran away, they left the gun on the spot and they thrust the money into Albert's hands as they went by." "I know. How did you guess where he was?" "To begin with, I made sure there was no cellar or attic here. Then I noticed that when you spoke to me, you sometimes raised your voice, as though you wanted to be heard by someone else. Originally, there was only one apartment on this floor. When they subdivided it, they left the communicating door but made it a double one. I mean that there's a door on each side of the wall with a gap between the two. Albert was in there. Only I was sure that the police, who had already come once, would search the house a second time. I didn't know if it was being watched. In order to find out, you appealed to me, knowing that I would keep you informed as to the course of the official inquiry. I was here to serve as a screen. I prevented suspicion from falling on your home, and at the same time I provided you with information. I came to realize this. Do you know, it was extremely bright of you." "Oh, Superintendent," she murmured, shamefaced. "I had to save Albert, didn't I? His accomplices would never have confessed the truth. He'd have taken the rap, particularly as they were convinced that we'd kept the money. I learned that from my brother, who was trying to protect you. Yesterday evening you went out to post the double letter you sent to your girlfriend in Boulogne." He pointed to her photograph. "That Madeleine, whose job it was to send back the threatening letters to you. Meanwhile, one of the accomplices took the opportunity to slip in here and look for the money. You came back, and he knocked you out with a bludgeon. Albert came out of his hiding place and rushed at him with a knife in his hand. That's it, isn't it?" He had anticipated her story, and he knew, furthermore, that it was Albert who had taken the two weapons into his hiding place. "I bet they're still there," he growled. He opened the communicating door and, as he had expected, found a rubber bludgeon and a blood-stained knife. "Where are you planning to meet him?" he asked, looking round for his hat. She hesitated, then stammered, "Must I tell you? Can I be quite sure that—" Then he laughed outright. "That I won't have you both arrested at the frontier? Is that what you're trying to imply?" "No, but you love your Albert so much, don't you? That the very idea that somebody else might—" He was close to the door, had his hand on the knob. "Actually, you're jealous." "Yes, indeed, Mademoiselle Berthe." "And jealous of me, moreover, because you'd wanted to save him all by yourself. Come to that, I can't prevent you, as soon as my back's turned, from getting up in spite of your injuries and taking the train to Brussels. I'm even willing to bet that a boutique selling Paris models will open there shortly. Goodbye, Mademoiselle Berthe." And because he wanted some small revenge after all, he called out as he left the room, "I shall send you my bill." Thank you very much for listening to this story, narrated by Jason Fraser. Don't forget to subscribe to the Detective Tales channel and be sure to leave a comment.